This week on the Andrew Yang podcast.
America, for 200 years, the gap between the richest and the poorest places in America was narrowing because people would move from poor places to rich places. If you were a janitor in Alabama 50 years ago and you moved to San Francisco, you'd pay more in rent. Your cost of living would go up, but you'd make a heck of a lot more as a janitor. You'd end up way ahead, like 40% ahead. And today, if that same janitor in Alabama tries moving to San Francisco, he'll still make more. In fact, he'll make a lot more. But his housing costs won't just cancel it out. It'll leave him net behind. The rational choice is to stay making a lot less. So you talk to people and they're kind of stuck.
It is my pleasure to welcome to the podcast historian, journalist, deputy executive editor at The Atlantic, and now author of the brand new book, Stuck: How the Privileged and the Propertied Broke the Engine of American Opportunity. We're going to dig into all of that. Yoni Appelbaum. Welcome, Yoni.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here.
Wow. So I was pumped to read the Atlantic piece that is an excerpt of your book because I have been freaked out about how little Americans have been moving for quite some time. When I ran for president, I even had a policy platform trying to get America moving again. But how the heck did you wind up writing an entire voluminous book on this topic?
I dug into this because I was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, as a grad student in an apartment that was already a little too small for my family, that already cost a little more than we could afford. And I was looking out my window, and I knew something as a historian about the neighborhood I lived in. I knew it was kind of a special place. For 100 years, it had been the place that the children of immigrants came to. They lived there, they gave their kids a better education than they'd received themselves, and launched their kids into success, into American life. It had done this so consistently for wave after wave after wave of immigrants that it had become sort of famous as an example, and sociologists had to coin a new term for the neighborhood. They called it a zone of emergence. This was, and you can find them in many American cities.
Sure.
And it was like a working class neighborhood where you could come in and you could find a decent place to live and give your kids a better future than you'd grown up with. But I was looking out my window, and that's not who was walking around my neighborhood anymore. It had become a neighborhood of young professionals.
What's the opposite of a zone of emergence?
Yeah. Well, it's a zone of exclusion. That's what it had really become. And it was an uncomfortable feeling. Cambridge had lost 2/3 of its kids. Families couldn't afford to live there anymore. You could see school buildings getting turned into condos. Something had gone wrong. And if it had just been Cambridge, that would have been a small story. But when I talked to people around the country, I kept hearing versions of this, seeing versions of it, that the places that had once given Americans a lot of opportunity, given them that sort of first broad rung on the ladder, those places, that they couldn't get a foothold anymore.
And so you, as an historian, you kind of trace how this changed in American life. And what's fun is that I think a lot of us have this image of those kinds of neighborhoods that you described. Certainly New York is filled with them, or was, more accurately. But there's some of the things you document from American history were fascinating. I had no idea that moving day was a holiday, but if you walk people through that, it gives one a sense of how much mobility was just assumed.
Yeah, and I think to really grasp moving day, which was wild, it was a third, half of a city or a rural area picking up and swapping homes in a single day. But to grasp it, you've got to understand how unusual it was in the world. That this was not just something that Americans took to a greater extent than other places. We really invented it. When the first settlers arrive in the United States from Europe, they're coming from a world where you are defined by the circumstances of your birth. If you're born in a town, you belong to that town. Your family has typically lived there for generations. In most places, you don't have the right to leave. You don't have the right to just go live someplace else. People start doing this in England as they get a sort of too much population in the countryside. They wash up in London, and it's so threatening to the people of London that there are these people not in their proper place in the hierarchy. they coin a new word for it. They call it the mobile vulgus, which they contract down to mob. Right, that's where we get a mob. It's people who are not in the place where they were born, not in the place they were assigned. And in America, we sort of open up the possibility that you can move. Not at first. If you try to move into a colonial town, you could be warned out. Most people who tried to move into colonial towns were warned out. They got a notice saying, you're not wanted here. You had no right, even if you bought a house, even if you had a job, you had no right to live there unless the community accepted you as a member. But around 1800, the law starts to change. And for the first time in human history, instead of communities choosing their members, people can choose their own communities. And once they do that, Americans just explode in this riot of mobility. And the ritual that they come to observe is moving day, when all the unwritten leases in the jurisdiction expire on the same day. People pile their belongings down by the curb. They hire cartmen to take them to someplace else. And pretty much everybody who's moving is going to end up living someplace slightly better than the place they've left. As long as you're adding new units to the market at the top of the market, everyone can bump up in this long chain of moves. And Europeans come over just to watch the spectacle. It's so wild to them that Americans are always seeking something slightly better than what they have, that they come over. It's a tourist attraction to watch the carts ride through the streets and everybody sort of piling all their belongings and moving in someplace new. It's a spectacle.
Yeah, and so the presumption there is that you have new housing units that got built. So check it out. Let's say it's like a frontiersy town is like the image, and so structures are going up all the time. New homes are being built, and so in any given year there'll be new housing units, and so everyone's looking around like, hey, maybe I can upgrade. And so what would happen is that you would upgrade, and then your apartment would be available. And so there are a bunch of presumptions here that were true then. So number one, housing stock increases in any given period. Number two, you're a renter, not an owner, and that was apparently the norm. So it did make me think it's like much later, and we can take this in turn. But like later, the American dream became home ownership, which would obviously end up making moving day less practical. So how long did moving day last? Like when did it kick up? And then, because I had never heard of it.
Yeah. My grandmother remembered moving day in New York. As late as World War II, you still have about 1 million people moving every May 1st in New York. So it stays well into the 20th century. But that's also the pivot point where we go from a society that's largely or majority renters to one that's majority homeowners. The homeowners do move too. Mortgages in that era are typically much shorter, maybe a 5-year mortgage, 50% down payment. It's not as hard to pick up and move on those terms. The transaction costs aren't as large. So you also get a lot of homeowners who are moving, because housing, they tend to regard it a little bit like an iPhone, right? Like you get a good one. You've got it for a few years and then you upgrade. And there's sort of a presumption, right? Maybe your next house has this one has running water, the next one has hot and cold running water, and then the one after that has gas heat, and that's really cool. So they're always rolling out these new features. People always think that they can do a little better than they've done, and so they're trading up consistently. And it's a whole different mentality. My favorite story about this is a woman who isn't going to move one year and is so embarrassed to be stuck in the same house in consecutive years that she draws the curtains so that her neighbors will think the house is empty and she's already moved on. It's a whole different mindset.
Shame on you staying in the same place for 2 years in a row. So there are some ideas baked in here. So number one, people immigrated to the U.S. So you obviously had one very, very big move. And then when you get here, then there was Manifest Destiny and westward expansion and all of that. So you have this, I think, idea of mobility that was baked into the American ethos. And for me, I'm the child of immigrants. And so there was also kind of a presumption on a couple levels. Number one, we just got here. And number two, you shouldn't feel that confined to any one place. That's not true of all immigrant families, I suppose, but I'll just share my own experience. So I was born in Schenectady, New York. My parents bought a very, very cheap house that I went back and visited. I brought my kids to visit the other month because I wanted them to see like the look where Dad was born, and it was very very. I mean, it's a very modest house in Schenectady, New York, which is a very pretty down to earth town. And then they moved to a house in Westchester County when I was 4 years old. And then they moved to another house in the next town over when I was 12 years old. And it was mainly just because they wanted a bigger, better house, honestly. And like that, the first house so you can actually, in my case personally, you see like saw a progression where you had, frankly, like a very very modest dwelling to like a middle classy dwelling to like maybe like like slightly nicer version. And so I always had this in my head that was, it's like I've never gotten that attached, frankly. Anyway, so I'm a renter right now in New York, as an example. It feels like we've somehow come full circle as a country where now you have, and we'll get to this, where now people are moving less, and your book lays out a bunch of very clear and convincing reasons why that is. One of the crazy things was that as a good, educated, policy-oriented human, I have always adored Jane Jacobs and lionized her as like this godmother of urban planning. But in your narrative, it's a little bit more of a mixed bag, I guess. Like the impact that Jane Jacobs had on the way we think about urban development.
Yeah, it's the danger of looking too closely at your heroes is that you may find that they're human after all. Jane Jacobs is this titanic figure in urban studies. She, at a moment when government wants to level neighborhoods in urban renewal, and usually it targets minority neighborhoods. It wants to run highways through cities. The planners want to separate things out, right? They want to tear down the old diverse uses of buildings and replace them with big concrete blocks. Jane Jacobs has the courage to say everything you hate about cities is actually what makes cities great. It's all those people mixed together. It's all those different uses in a confined space. It's the fact that they've grown organically and messily. That's what makes cities great. That's what makes them attractive. And your planning is going to ruin all of that. And she writes this brilliant book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, where she lays this all out.
Yeah, I just want to say I read that book in my 20s, and I this is how nerdy I am. I don't even think I was assigned it. Like, I think I read that book for pleasure. Anyway, continue.
Yeah, and it's a great book, and I love that book. And the problem is that the cure turned out to be worse than the disease. Not at first. She was pointing to real problems. She's part of a cohort of reformers in the 1960s and 70s who are looking at government and saying government has become the problem. It's no longer serving the public interest. The big agencies that we created in the New Deal have fallen, they've been captured by the industries they're supposed to be regulating. So Rachel Carson says, the pesticides are creating a silent spring. They're killing all the birds. And Ralph Nader says, the cars are unsafe at any speed. The highway regulators are in cahoots with Big Auto. And Jane Jacobs says the people managing our cities have sold them out to developers and just want to level the cities. And they're right about this, by the way. In fact, government has gotten too close to big business in those years. But the solution that they all hit upon is to let people second guess government decisions in court. So you created a government decision-making process, and then you give people the right to sue to challenge whether the decisions have been properly made. And they have a model in their head of how communities will challenge this. They said the government should have to come to the community for comment. It should have to take those comments into account, and it should have to follow a whole elaborate process that weighs different considerations and balance. And if it deviates at all from any of that, you can challenge it. Even if it doesn't deviate, you can challenge it and claim that it did.
Sure.
And they imagine that the people who are going to do this are people who share their values, people who are always pursuing the public interest as they understand it. But they've opened Pandora's box. What happens, what Jane Jacobs does, is she gives anyone who wants, who has enough time and enough money and enough education to stop the government from doing things. And, that damage is real and has kept us from, I think, building the kinds of things we need. But it has a second aspect to it, which is that for 100 years, America had been rolling out zoning, and zoning made all new construction of housing subject to government approval. So it's a two-step. First, you use zoning, and it makes all housing subject to government approval. And then you create this distributed veto that the wealthy can exercise. And pretty soon what you've got is nobody can build a private building on private land to meet private demand for housing. And that just makes housing prohibitively expensive. She herself does this. She buys a townhouse in the West Village. The building she'll be living in, as she tells us how great mixed-use neighborhoods are. And she buys it. It's got a candy store on the ground floor. I talked to the grandkids of the guy who ran the candy store. They've got fond memories of it. And it was a neighborhood institution. But when she moves in, she does what somebody might do in that circumstance. She rips out the street front retail. She takes off the historic facade of the building to put new modern windows on. And she turns into a single family home. So there's sort of two Jane Jacobs. There's the one who brilliantly writes about everything that makes cities vibrant and vital. You got to let new people in. You've got to mix incomes. You've got to mix backgrounds. And then there's the Jane Jacobs who doesn't do that in her own neighborhood. In fact, she gut renovates this mixed use building. She landmarks the block so that nobody else can build on it. And the property values skyrocket. It's like $7,000 when she buys it. It's like $6 million now. And so the West Village is not the West Village that she lived in. She kept the shell. It's still the same buildings, but it's like taxidermied, right? You can see it. It's like frozen at that lifelike moment. But these days, the West Village is a place for rich people. It's no longer a vibrant and vital neighborhood that's giving people a chance to make it in America.
Thank you, listeners. Please make sure to like and subscribe. And if you have any questions, send them to mailbag@andrewyang.com, and we'll do our best to answer them. Thank you. So Americans are moving around doing their thing, and then you say there is this two-step process. So number one is zoning. Before zoning came along, people could just build wherever they wanted, I guess. And so which probably had problems for sure. But so when did zoning kick in?
Yeah, this is a really interesting story. Zoning starts we know the specific place where we first get zoning in America. It's 1885 in Modesto, California. There was land use law before zoning, right? So you couldn't just do something that was going to hurt your neighbors. But they had to show real damage, right? So if you had a tannery with lots of obnoxious, foul-smelling stuff on the property, you couldn't build that next to somebody who was living next to you. But that was how the law worked. You had to show a real harm. People could do what they wanted with their private property right up until the point that they were harming others. And maybe that was creating a fire hazard, or maybe it was, a factory that was polluting. So you could regulate what people could do, but you couldn't say something is perfectly fine, but we're only going to let you do it in one place and not in another place. That was not legal. In Modesto, they've got a problem. The problem is that Modesto is filling up with two populations. One population is white gold rush miners and people who are trying to make it in California. The other population is Chinese Americans who are trying to make it in California. Good times.
Let's go. Chinese American railroad workers.
Yeah, they get kicked off the railroads, and they're trying to find something to do to still have access to the American dream. To survive, right? And there is something that people desperately need in California in these years. The gold rush, they're really it's dirty work. Their clothes are dirty, but they will not stoop to do their own laundry. They consider laundry to be women's work. It gets so, I'm not making this up, it gets so desperate that a clever entrepreneur in San Francisco makes it his business to collect everyone's dirty laundry, to put it on a boat in San Francisco and send it to Hawaii to get washed. And then they return the clean laundry by boat like 6 weeks later back to San Francisco. That's how desperate they are.
Yes, and the Chinese are like, we'll wash your clothes.
Yeah, they're like, great, that's a job. Like, we need a job. This is a job. We're going to make it in America. We'll wash your clothes. So they set up these laundries, and they live in their laundries, right? These are, like most small shopkeepers, they live above the business. And they put the laundries into white neighborhoods because that's where the customers are. All of this makes perfect sense. They're doing exactly what everybody else in America is doing. They're chasing opportunity. And the white people in Modesto are really mad about it. And the first thing they try is arson. They try burning down the laundries. And the Chinese entrepreneurs rebuild. They're not going to let somebody drive them out. The next thing they try is vigilante violence. They put on hoods and march through Chinatown and smash windows and beat people up. And again, the Chinese rebuild. The third thing they try is zoning. They write a law which says you can only operate a laundry west of the tracks and south of G Street. And it's a clever law because it doesn't say anything about the Chinese.
Yeah.
But if you look, I pulled an old map of Modesto, and if you look in that year, there's only one block of buildings west of the tracks and south of G Street, and it's got a label on it. It says Chinatown, right? So this is a ghettoization law. This is a law which says all the Chinese need to move into Chinatown. And what they figured out was if you segregate the use of land, you can segregate the population. That's where zoning comes from.
So other communities then see this Modesto zoning and are like, oh, you can do that? Let's do that too.
It takes a little while because it's still kind of blatantly unconstitutional. In California, the elected judges understand their voters hate the Chinese enough to allow it, but it doesn't instantly spread to other states. It jumps to New York City in 1916, where you get the nation's first comprehensive zoning code. And it's the same kind of story. In New York, the problem is that the rich merchants on Fifth Avenue are really ticked off that Jewish garment workers are coming out of the garment lofts, the sweatshops on their lunch breaks, and they're standing on the sidewalk and scaring off their elite customers.
Can't have that, yeah.
Can't have that, right? They complain. They call the cops on them, and they get them hauled away to jail for loitering. But that's a little awkward because, they may be immigrants, but they still vote, and the politicians are not so happy with this. And what they hit on is we can do what Modesto did. We'll put in a zoning ordinance. We'll push these garment workers back into the Lower East Side, and we won't have to deal with them anymore. And the mayor says, well, you can do that, but it's a little obvious if we just do it on Fifth Avenue. So we'll do it citywide so that it's not so obvious to the voters exactly what we're doing here. And you get a citywide zoning ordinance that for the first time really sorts things out. But it has a pernicious effect. It's not just about pushing one population down. It's about limiting the ability of people to build, to meet demand. And they need to take it nationwide. This is the catch. The guy who comes up with the ordinance, he says, I know this is unconstitutional. I know the Supreme Court is going to strike it down because you obviously can't do this. But there's a loophole. If it's spread widely enough, by the time the first challenge gets to the Supreme Court, they'll uphold it. So if we spread zoning nationwide quickly enough, we can pull this off and turn something that's blatantly illegal into something that's legal. And he does. He proselytizes for this, and zoning starts to spread nationwide.
So zoning is the first big step. And then the second step is giving people in a neighborhood essentially veto rights over any new development. And Francis Fukuyama coined the term vetocracy, which is, hey, I might not be able to do something, but I can keep you from doing it too. So now no one can do anything. So that kind of freezes a lot of neighborhoods and development. And I will say, if you live in a particular place, it's generally in your economic interest to kind of keep a ton of new housing stock from going up, because then you wind up reducing your own values because of, what have you, it being overcrowded or noise or small lots or traffic or, you name it. So that ends up mushrooming in various ways. I think people can see pretty clearly in their heads, like, oh, okay, if you don't build any new housing stock, then that's going to end up pushing people out over time. And now you fast forward, that phenomenon has hit particularly hard in major urban areas, which tend to be blue. So the ones that people think of in American life when they think of this would be New York, San Francisco, Boston. I think those are the big three that I think of. You could throw some other cities in the mix, but that there winds up being this sense, and this was like one thing that came up in the argument you're making that I thought was interesting. The suggestion was that, look, if you made things better and more efficient, there'd be more people moving into these cities because these are more affluent, higher productivity zones, and the
Yes.
economic opportunities would be better. That you would wind up just with like many, many more people in the New Yorks, the Bostons, the San Franciscos.
But that's not what's happened, right? Like it's a really interesting split. For 200 years, Americans moved to the places with faster growing economies. And they weren't always the same places. Moving to Flint, Michigan in 1920 was a terrific bet. You're going to give your kids a much better life. Moving there in 2020 is not a terrific bet.
I have been to Flint, Michigan, and it is not terrific. I mean, sorry. I mean, the people there are great, but it's a hard hit community.
The people are great. I spent a week there just walking around, talking to developers, to civic leaders, to ordinary residents, trying to understand, everybody there, their grandparents at most moved to Flint, right? Like it was a place that really sprang up out of nothing. And so the mobility is in their blood, like that they all moved there. And I wanted to understand why people are still there. And when you talk to people about their housing stories, just the way you narrated yours, right? What I heard were stories like, I wanted to get out. I had a buddy who had rented an apartment down in Miami. I went down there. I got a job. He moved on. I couldn't pay the rent by myself on the job that I found. So I came back to Flint. Or I'd really like to be with my sisters in Texas, but I'm paying $140 a month in rent here. And I asked her what she's paying, and I can't afford that. Or I have a house, and even if I sold it and took the sales price, it wouldn't be enough for a down payment in a place with jobs. So you talk to people, and they're kind of stuck in cities like that. I can't stress how weird that is, right? Like America, for 200 years, the gap between the richest and the poorest places in America was narrowing because people would move from poor places to rich places. If you were a janitor in Alabama 50 years ago and you moved to San Francisco, you'd pay more in rent. Your cost of living would go up, but you'd make a heck of a lot more as a janitor. You'd end up way ahead, like 40% ahead.
Yeah.
And today, if that same janitor in Alabama tries moving to San Francisco, he'll still make more. In fact, he'll make a lot more. But his housing costs won't just cancel it out. It'll leave him net behind. He'll have less money in the bank account at the end of every month. The rational choice is to stay making a lot less. And it's not just that he's not making more as a janitor. The cool thing about moving, and I think really something that we don't focus on enough, is that moving is a chance to redefine your whole life, right? When you move from one place to another, you're getting a new set of social relationships. You're usually switching jobs. You're often switching occupations. You arrive, maybe you're working in an old declining industry where you're coming from. But when you land in a new city, you look around for where the jobs are. And the jobs are usually in the fast growing industries. And so it often is a way to get people to switch from the declining parts of the economy to the ascending parts of the economy. When there's a negative shock, right, that closes a factory, a free trade deal, or automation, we rely in this country on people being able to get new jobs that are being fostered by the savings that these things have achieved. That's the whole deal, right? Like we'll lose some, but there's creative destruction and there'll be creation coming out of it too. But if you're stuck in the place where the old job was and you can't move to the city where the new job is, then you're just screwed.
Have you made a New Year's resolution that's related to eating healthier, being a little bit more fit, losing a little bit of weight? Well, have I got great news for you. Factor meals can help you actually achieve that goal. Imagine fully prepared meals sent to you fresh. I'm good at a lot of things, I will confess, but I'm really crappy at cooking. And Factor makes it so that you can have a completely delicious, awesome meal in the comfort of your own home that's healthy, it's good for you. You know when you eat something and you know it's healthy? That's the experience with Factor. When I ordered it, the Nona's Bolognese, the mustard chicken, they hit the spot. They're quick, they're convenient, they get the job done, and then some. Eat smart with Factor. Get started at factormeals.com/factorpodcast and use code FACTORPODCAST to get 50% off your first box plus free shipping. That's code FACTORPODCAST at factormeals.com/factorpodcast to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. Yeah, it's just, like only one half the equation happened, which was the destruction, and then
Yeah.
you were there, and communities that are hard hit in that way. I mean, like the suffering is very, very real. I've been to any number of those communities over the last number of years, even before I ran for president. I mean, people who know my history know, like I worked in entrepreneurship in the Midwest and the South primarily. So Yoni, you have some numbers for this. Like people now, and one stat that stuck out to me was that when someone says that they'd like to move, they're now 50% less likely to actually follow through. I was like, oh no,
Yeah.
like like that's terrible. So like, what are the stats you like to cite when you talk about how Americans are now moving less?
Yeah. In the 19th century, probably 1 out of 3 Americans moved every year.
Yeah, that's
As late,
yeah,
it's
that's
like a
wild.
crazy amount of mobility,
That's
right?
wild.
People just found it totally wild when they came over from other countries. They're like, what is with these Americans? They have something perfectly good and they still think their kids can have something better. Don't they know their proper place? But they kept moving. As late as 1970, it's 1 in 5. So it doesn't decline that much. And then from 1970 to the present, it's fallen dramatically. We just got new numbers from the census. It's now down to 1 out of 13. We set a new record for immobility last year. So the decline is really, really sharp. And what I point to is exactly what you were saying. I'm not saying anyone should be forced to move. I don't know where you should live. Everybody's going to make their own decision. They're going to find the housing that works for them and for their family. There's all kinds of reasons to stay where you are. In a highly mobile society, though, staying is an active choice,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So if you want to stay close to your family, you want to keep your job, you love your house, great. You're making a decision to stay. People, even if they make that same decision, if they feel like they never had the chance, that's tremendously dispiriting, right? Like where it becomes not an active decision, but something imposed on you by large external forces. Um, the people, most Americans will tell you that they want to move, but they become dramatically less likely, half as likely to actually follow through on that. And the people who can't move, we know something about the psychology of that. They grow more cynical. They're less likely to remain actively involved with organizations or voluntary associations in their community. They're likely to experience a degree of political rage. They're also likely to see the pie as having a fixed size. And anyone else who comes into their community and gets a slice of that pie, that's coming at their expense. And so they grow more hostile to immigration, they grow more hostile to internal migration, more hostile to change of all kinds. People who want to move and follow through on that ambition to move, we know something about their psychology too, right? That the researchers tell us they become more optimistic. Um, they tend to stop seeing the world as a zero-sum game. They tend to believe like, if you're helping this place grow and I'm helping this place grow, we're both better off for it. They become more likely to reach out and to join things, to make new relationships, and more optimistic that things will be better for their kids. So there's like moving. Everyone who forms the intention to move, right? We're not selecting for sort of the people who are inclined versus those who aren't. Right? Among the people who want to move, if they get to follow through, they tend to want to produce the kind of country that has the values that America has traditionally had. And if they're frustrated in those aims, they go looking for someone to blame.
the summary of that is a mindset of abundance versus a mindset of scarcity.
Yeah.
And when I was in Ohio, not to single out Ohio, but a woman said to me, around here, change is a 4-letter word. And I heard that and was like, what the heck does that even mean? Like, one, it's actually not a 4-letter word, so it didn't make sense. But but she took the time to explain to me that for them, change meant something closing or someone leaving. And then one of the things that hit me was imagining being in an environment where your top people have a goal to leave and then they do leave. So that if you're still there, then you're like, okay, like I'm not in a position to leave, and then you start hunkering down and feeling negatively. And that woman helped explain to me a lot. And it's not something. Well, one of the things that in like I get frustrated by is when people kind of blame others for having particular attitudes. Where I just think to myself, it's like, well, reversed, I'd probably have a similar attitude. But the fact that moving is an act of optimism. And
Mhm.
what's interesting in your description, which I actually love, is that if someone does follow through and move, they actually become more optimistic, because when they get to this new place, they're like, oh, let me figure this out. Let me go meet some people. Let me go do the things. That.
Totally, right?
Yeah.
And it's uncomfortable. And like most uncomfortable experiences, we avoid it if at all we can. It's uncomfortable to have somebody build a new building on your block, and it's uncomfortable to move from one place to another. But that discomfort is actually a spur. Being lonely is healthy. Being alone is not healthy. Being lonely is experiencing an emotion, right? You're like, I really don't like being lonely. I'm going to go to the bar and I'm actually going to talk to the person sitting next to me, even though it's super uncomfortable to strike up a conversation, because I'd like to meet somebody. I'm going to go to church on Sunday, even though I haven't been in years. I'm going to, right? Like you start pushing yourself out of your comfort zone.
Yeah.
And that's a really healthy thing.
The thing I think of, you're even just like finding your new places to grab a sandwich, or your new
Right.
places, your new place to work out or whatever it is. Like when you figure those things out, it's actually like, oh, that there's like this positive stimulation that occurs.
That woman in Ohio, that's such a great story. And it really resonates, I think, with a lot of things that I've heard from people too. It's rational to live in a declining community and to be mad about it and to be fearful of change. But Ohio is a very particular place. It was the first boom state in America. When we opened up settlement, people flooded in. It was the place that first invented the right of mobility. It was the first place to make it to the legal changes where people could just decide what community they were going to live in. It's also, by 1840, the first bust state in America. It starts shedding large amounts of its population because people are moving on. They're going to Illinois. They're going to Indiana. There's other states beckoning. And it's the first place that has to deal with this. You could look at Ohio in 1840 and say, get out, right? Like this is just not a place that's rising in the world anymore. But people stick around in Ohio. Not all of them, right? Lots of them move. But people keep flooding into Ohio from elsewhere. It still has opportunities. By the 1880s, Cleveland is like the wealthiest city in America. You've got John D. Rockefeller setting up shop there. And there's nothing inevitable about this. If you're in a declining community today, I'm not saying like shut down the declining communities and everybody flee. Those declining communities today could be the boom towns of tomorrow. We've been through many boom and bust cycles in America, but you've got to have the ability to let people relocate toward opportunities as they open up if you're going to get them to boom again.
This podcast is sponsored by Helix Sleep. I've been on a quest for the perfect mattress for my entire adult life. Why? Well, you do it 8 hours a day. I like to be active. My back sometimes acts up. So I wanted a firm mattress that offered me support, that did not overheat. I took the Helix Sleep quiz and got matched with a Dawn firm mattress. And it's been a game changer. It's been awesome. I have not had a single issue. And I got to say, people have come up to me and said, hey, I ordered a Helix Sleep mattress and it's all been rave reviews, not a single issue. It's been an awesome partnership. And the biggest partnership is that I lie down on the freaking mattress every night and I wake up refreshed and ready to go. Don't take my word for it. Go to helixsleep.com and check it out for yourself. And if you order a mattress, you can always return it without any issue because they have that much confidence in the product. Go to helixsleep.com/yang for a President's Day sale of 27% off site-wide. That's helixsleep.com/yang for 27% off site-wide. helixsleep.com/yang. Yeah, and we made it very difficult to move into a lot of like the richer cities. Honestly, I mean, I I look at the rents here in New York. It's like, what is going on? The whole thing that seems very daunting.
My grandfather's tenement is still there. I went to see it on the Lower East Side. This was the tenement reformers targeted his building in particular, where he was renting an apartment at the time, as they believed that tenements were more, apartment life was morally corrupting and degrading. That to live in an apartment was to become degraded. I could not rent my grandfather's. It's $7,200 a month now to get into that tenement apartment. If you want, like, for me, that was the shift in New York, right? That once you stop building the housing, the places that had fresh off the boat immigrants who were finding that first not particularly nice apartment, but the one that gave them a little toehold in America, the chance to give something a little bit better for their kids. We've regulated them out of existence, and it's much harder. You can see the migrant crisis in New York today. It's a little funny to me to hear it described as a migrant crisis. As a percentage of New York, the number of people currently arriving in the city is minuscule compared to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But there's no available housing for them. And if you have a city that cannot grow, it cannot absorb. And so you're going to get a crisis even with a relatively small number of new arrivals. And so you look at that and people can see the problem, but they may not understand that the problem is that they regulated the cheap housing out of existence and didn't let anyone build. They may just see the problem is that there are people who, in their view, don't belong there.
Well, Yoni, I think you've done a tremendous job diagnosing an underrated problem in American life. I'm going to suggest, just for fun, like I don't think it's particularly political in the sense that, frankly, anyone who has the ability to like turn off development's going to make that choice. And so it's structural. Like we've got a structural problem. Now, I'm an advisor to a company called PadSplit that enables homeowners to rent their spare bedroom, which is, I think, very wholesome, and it helps people access housing in a more affordable way. It's just scratching the surface of the depth of the problem that you've identified that I agree is distorting America's culture, economy, family lives, mindset, like, you name it. And so how do we get unstuck? Like what are the big moves? And I'm happy to say I feel like a lot of people are catching on now to the depth of this problem. Like, people are really angry about housing unaffordability as they should be. Lack of affordable housing is certainly holding back things like family formation and people having kids. So what is the cure? So you've diagnosed a problem very, very compellingly. And because you're an historian, you actually kind of walk us through it in a way that people are like, oh, okay, I can see how that happened. So is there a path towards being either less stuck or unstuck?
Yeah, and I think this is really good news because the changes are relatively recent. And I want people to see how recent those changes are and how many of them are inadvertent. And that, there are problems in America that have been here from the founding. This is one we've created in recent decades out of a set of changes that nobody quite thought through. And it's relatively easily reversible, too. It's also a problem that can be largely addressed at the state and local level. The federal government has a role to play, but you don't need to wait on our dysfunctional Congress. You don't need to bet on the current administration. If people are looking for change in their own communities, this is something that they can do tomorrow. And I've got sort of three big, broad solutions that I think we should pursue. The
Please, let's
first is,
go. Let's go
yeah,
local.
yeah,
Let's go. Let's do it.
let's go local, right? The first one is consistency. Zoning rules are wildly inconsistent from place to place. If you master New York City's zoning code with its different designations and its overlays, you do those other combinations. There's hundreds of different zoning designations that are possible in New York. If you want to build in New York, your first move is to hire a lawyer, not an architect. That makes it really, really hard for anyone to take any solution to scale. Right, a building that works in one part of the city simply won't be allowed in another part of the city, and a building that works well in New York, you can't build it in any other city. So, if we get consistent zoning designations across cities, a much smaller number of categories that restore the right to build as of right? So you can just say, hey, I'm going to put up a building. It's in compliance. I don't need to go through an elaborate review process. I can just do this right now. That would unleash a tremendous wave of construction in the places that we most need it. And to the extent that builders, designers figure out good solutions in one place, they could take it across the country.
Wow. Be like
which you can't do right now. Wow. Construction is one of our most local industries, because if you figured out how to build in Denver, it does not help you build in New York. And if you know how to build in San Francisco, you can't go build in Boston. So if we can get these consistent rules, we can really scale the solutions, which would be huge, and get the efficiency gains that construction just has not had over the last 50 years. The second thing is we need to be a little bit more tolerant. And you've already run into this, I imagine, trying to figure out how to let people rent spare bedrooms. We have a lot of regulations in this country that imagine that there is only one solution for housing, the single family home. Sometimes they reluctantly allow apartments.
Yoni, I mean, this is like, so, because maybe it's because I'm in, child of immigrants or whatever. I just frankly imagine like a lot of people in a dwelling, like when you talk about when New York was absorbing tons of immigrants back in the day, like I just imagine people show up and be like, hey, your plot of the floor is over there because, you're my second cousin from like wherever the heck. And like, we've got eight people in this,
For sure.
this
The
little
guy who
house.
writes the first zoning code, Edward Murray Bassett, is living up in Albany as a young man, up in your former neck of the woods, and he rents a spare bedroom because, of course, he does. Like, it's a practical solution to the fact that he's a young man without much starting off in life. And then he comes down to New York and he makes it illegal for anyone else to do that. That is the second solution: is we need to tolerate a much wider array of housing options. We've seen in industries that have deregulated a little bit that consumers actually want a variety of choices, and it can be beneficial for everyone. And the solution that works for you at one stage of your life may not be the one that works at others.
Let's get that starter bedroom. Forget the starter home. Let's get you that starter bedroom.
Get the starter bedroom. You rent a bedroom in somebody's house. Maybe that's right for you at first. Maybe I live in a single family home right now. I love it. By the time I am old, I may not love the number of stairs I have in my house. I may need a house that's much more accessible, but it's not in my neighborhood because you can't build them here, right? So if you allow a greater variety of housing styles, you can allow people to find the thing at each moment of their life that's going to be the solution for them. I think that's huge. And then the last is a word we've thrown around already. It's abundance. We have a 50-year deficit to make up. I think one reason that building is hard is that people's personal observations don't square with what the economists are telling them, right? So they see a new building go up in their neighborhood and somebody says, we're going to add more housing supply. We're going to meet the demand. It's going to be great. And then the next year, their rent went up anyway. And they say, see, it doesn't work. Building just makes things more expensive. But it's like you're adding a teaspoon to a bathtub of need, right? It's what you've actually got to do is build enough housing that the prices come down. And there are cities that are trying this. Austin, Texas has actually seen rents decline by 7% this year. It put up enough new housing that the rents came down. You can do it, but it's not going to happen one building on the block. It's not going to happen in just one city. If we tackle this as a national crisis and say, hey, we've got to let people move into the places where they want to go, we've got to connect people with opportunity, then we can really scale the solutions.
This podcast is sponsored by ExpressVPN. How did you choose which internet service provider to use? The sad thing is, most of us didn't have much of a choice because ISPs operate a lot like monopolies in the regions that they serve. They then use this monopoly position to take advantage of customers, and yes, they even sell your data, your activities to advertisers and big tech companies, and you don't see a dime. That's why I protect my internet surfing and devices with ExpressVPN. When you use ExpressVPN, it's like a magic portal to a perfectly safe and anonymous internet. And don't take my word for it. This is the #1 VPN service according to CNET. It's used by major companies all over the world. So stop handing over your personal data to ISPs and other tech companies who then mine your activity and sell off your information. Protect yourself with a VPN I trust to keep my privacy online. Visit expressvpn.com/yang. That's expressvpn.com/yang to get 3 extra months free. Go to expressvpn.com/yang right now to learn more. Yeah, Austin is a bright spot. They have been very aggressive at attacking this. I mean, Austin is a boom town. And easily could have gone the path of New York or Boston or San Francisco, but then some people I actually know went in there and were like, "Yo, we're gonna make it so that you." I think the way they did it is like if it's not approved in a punctual manner, then it's assumed to be approved, which is like an incredible switch. I mean, in New York, it's like you could be waiting for months for an approval that might never come. And in Austin, they essentially reversed it. They put the onus on the government to get its act together. And one of the pieces of that story, Yoni, is that people now see their houses as storehouses of value that can only go up in price. But that's not the way that it was intended or historical. They're not banks, they're houses. And so, if you're building enough of them, then the prices don't necessarily just go up and up and up.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is there's a generational change here, and I don't know if you've seen it, but when I go to hearings, this is why I do in the spare time. Sometimes I go to zoning hearings because they're super fun, and but you walk in the room and you'll see. I went to one hearing not far from where I live, where they're trying to build condos on a parking lot next to a transit station, and somebody stood up and testified and said, I was at the first hearing on this project 25 years ago. They're still arguing over, by the way, the largely vacant parking lot, whether or not it would be good to add housing there. And I still oppose it. And she gave all the reasons that she opposed it. But then many of the other people at the hearing saw the world in a different way. Younger generations in America understand that they don't have access to the same opportunity. They look at this and they don't see, it's an environmental burden to build housing. They look at it and they say, no, growth is good. Actually, what we need to do is to grow in a smart way. Putting housing next to transit, that's going to help us with global warming. That's not hurting the environment, it's helping it. Adding affordable units to our community, that's not changing the character of the community, it's preserving it. It's continuing to make this a welcoming place for new arrivals. And so, you look at a place like Austin that's doing exactly what you talked about earlier, right? It's solving this at a structural level. It's making big structural changes. So you're not fighting one building at a time. You're saying, okay, we're going to shift the whole presumption that construction is good, and you should come up with a good reason for not doing it. If you're going to block it. And if you do that, if you change where the burden of proof lies, if you tap the energy, and I think you've seen this, there is energy among younger Americans for dramatic change. They really do feel as if the country is not working the way it should. These are attainable solutions. I'll tell you one more story, which is, we started in my Cambridge apartment where I'm looking out the window and seeing that something's gone badly wrong. I did two things that night. I went back and started the research for this book. And I got together with some friends in somebody's dining room in a crowded apartment, and we started a group called A Better Cambridge to advocate for upsending, for more construction. And we were very clear about why we were doing it. We wanted young families to be able to stay in the city. We wanted people to be able to come to the city. We wanted to preserve Cambridge's working and middle-class families. And we didn't have a prayer in hell. We were pretty much laughed out of the council at first. Earlier this week, after more than a decade of effort, and this people, I've long since moved on from Cambridge, but people took up that torch, and Cambridge upzoned the entire city. You can now build up to 6 stories anywhere in Cambridge. That didn't happen overnight. It happened wave after wave of people, because the original founders are mostly not there anymore because we all left. But new people came in and they decided that their community could again be a place that gave people a lot of opportunity, and they pulled it off. And to me, it's sort of a good story about how political change happens. It often happens at the local level, takes a lot of hard work, but there's a lot of energy out there. And if you convince people that actually America could get better, we can restore its promise, then people will sign up for that.
Let's make moving day a thing again. Appreciate the heck out of your work on this issue, which again I think is a huge driver of the inequality and lack of dynamism in the U.S. The book is Stuck: How the Privileged and the Propertied Broke the Engine of American Opportunity. And Yoni, if people want to keep up with you and your work outside of just going to the Atlantic, which I read regularly, like how can they best keep up with you?
You can follow me on X. I'm at Y Appelbaum. You can visit my webpage, yoniappelbaum.com. I'd love to hear from folks.
Yeah, and you can tell that Yoni's a compelling storyteller. It's a very, very engaging book that teaches you a lot about America and also about what we can do to improve our own communities. Congratulations again.
Thank you so much.